Hello, class. Chapter 6, Telephone and Online Crisis Counseling is the topic for this PowerPoint. Okay, so how do people handle, why do people call crisis lines? Well, the main reason is they're very convenient. There's immediacy of access. There's a lot of 24-hour hotlines that are available. There's national hotlines, local hotlines, so there's lots of access to talk to somebody for somebody who is in crisis. There's also anonymity. There's a lot of guilt and embarrassment, shame or self-blame or emotions that make facing crisis very difficult with face-to-face with strangers, particularly if you're in the middle of an aftermath of a traumatic event. Opening yourself up to somebody puts you in a very vulnerable position. So there's an ability to hide behind a phone or an online conversation or dialogue. This is especially true for teenagers, those who are socially isolated, psychologically desperate, or even the relatively stable person who has just a one-shot crisis. Telephone counselors understand that clients have these feelings and are not concerned about identifying a client unless there's a life-threatening emergency. Control. You know what? Because of all these feelings that clients have, it's easy for them to hang up. If they feel like things aren't going well in a phone call, they can just hang up the phone. There's an immediacy of access. It's great that they have somebody on the other line instantly. They don't have to wait for people to get home. They can just get a hold of somebody. Cost effectiveness. They're inexpensive for both the client and the community. Clients who can't pay for private therapy or afford transportation can usually use the phone. Most people have a cell phone these days. Therapeutic effectiveness, when the researchers look at volunteers who staff crisis lines, they find that the single most important discovery in the history of suicide intervention have been these volunteers. They have very few predispositions about their professional role, and they're seen as being kind of credible people who want to do good out of the bottom of their heart. So they like the idea that there could be a volunteer on a helpline. Even though volunteers really do go through a great deal of training, and I've had students before that have sat on crisis lines and have had to go through a great deal of training, but basically they have really good success rates is what they found. It's pretty good access to support system right away. One of the main reasons that people call hotlines is for social support. Many people are lonely or anxious or isolated by illness, and they just need to talk to somebody. They could be a shut-in or shy, recently divorced, widowed. You just don't know what people are going through, and they just need to reach out and have somebody that they can talk to. So support groups make extensive use of the telephone networks, from AA to all sorts of support groups, eating disorder support groups. Basically, they just look for people that can understand what they're saying. There's an avoidance of dependency issues. Since they aren't always the same person answering the phone when they call in, they don't get dependent on one worker to help them. There's an availability of others for consultation. If something is going on on the crisis line, they can ask somebody else at the agency for consultation so that they can get help, the crisis workers. There's an availability of an array of services. An example would be in Cleveland, the 211 United Way helpline. You call in there and tell them what you need, and they provide you with a list of support services. Excuse me. There are services to large and isolated geographic areas. Sometimes these lines provide service and referral for areas up to 150 miles away. So particularly if you live in a rural area, a crisis line might be your best option. So how do you start in a telephone counseling setting? What do you start with? You start with making psychological contact. This is all about building support and making that the priority, and then defining the problem. Usually they have a list of feeling words that describe emotions. There's standard questions that they review, and then they keep notes on the clients. And then they want to make sure that they're safe and that they're providing support. And these are where you see questions that start with, do you have people you can talk to, or do you have pills with you right there, right with you now? Are you alone, or is there someone that could help you before you kill yourself? Very specific questions that will help them understand that you're looking to see if they have any support that would stop them from hurting themselves. You want to look at alternatives in making plans. It's really important to create alternatives, and it's even more important in telephone counseling because you want to alleviate the immediate situational threat. They need to jointly explore alternatives that are simple and clear cut. You can't see what they look like or their surroundings, or you don't know any of the nonverbal stuff that you would see if you were with somebody. So it's really important to go in a slow, step-by-step manner to make sure that there's, a physical, like a psychological connection, and that they understand what you're talking about. No plan should be accepted until the client can reassure the worker that he or she thoroughly understands whatever the plan is they come up with and has the ability and the means to put it into action. Errors and fallacies. You're not perfect. If you feel you're being manipulated by somebody, then you probably are. It's very important. People are very scared about crisis, to put it mildly. There's a lot of concerns about what if you don't find something out, but you're not there to be an instant expert. Your thoughts are, if only I were a licensed social worker, I could help this person. If those are your thoughts, then you are doomed to fail. Nobody's an expert on everything that comes in the crisis line. There's no specific piece of information, if found, that was going to magically transform a caller into somebody with good mental health. Second, talking about whatever it is, from suicide to getting a hair replacement, will not make it happen. A lot of times when I'm teaching students, they're afraid to ask the question, are you safe? Do you have thoughts of harming yourself? Do you have thoughts of harming other people? Because they think if they ask that question, it's going to create the scenario. That's not true. Sometimes callers need to manipulate you as serving a purpose. So you don't want to be manipulated. But if you feel like you're being manipulated, you probably are. All callers that call in are not loving human beings. And you do not have to be Mother Teresa, loving and caring and sharing to all. Many people call exactly because they are not loving human beings. They're often overbearing, boring, nasty, assaultive, insulting, hateful, pain in the neck. Having made that assessment, you now know why the caller is facing rejection from others and can speak directly to how his or her actions affect you and reflect on how those actions could be problematic when dealing with other people. In your textbook, there's a list of all defining every one of these different personality types that could be difficult for somebody. They're on pages 126 through 128. So I would ask you to read through each of those individually. So how do you handle a severely disturbed caller? You just looked at what behavior is, how it's purposeful and has meaning, and it's consistent with personalities, even if it's exaggerated, and that behavior we use is to keep us safe and free from anxiety. So how do we help a severely disturbed caller? We want to slow the emotions down and focus on the here and now. How you speak to somebody makes a difference. You should speak in slow and calm tones. Refuse to share hallucinations and delusions. You don't want to affirm a paranoid delusions are real, but do not. We don't want to agree on its validity. We want to ask when questions rather than why questions, and we want to determine if they're on medication. Sometimes changing, forgetting, or disregarding medication can create some of these hallucinations or delusions. And it's important to kind of have a physician's desk reference to understand different medications, because we are not usually pharmacists. All right, keeping expectations realistic. It's very important to realize that somebody doesn't generally become severely disturbed overnight, and they're probably not going to be able to Eliminate all crisis psychiatric problems in your one phone call with somebody. So it's really important to sort of set a time period where you're trying to help them maintain control and contact with reality. If they don't seem to be moving in that direction, then challenging them, that saying that you're concerned enough to get an ambulance involved and get them to the hospital is probably a good next step. How do you maintain professional distance when you're hearing all sorts of things from somebody on the other line? We can feel threatened, we can feel inadequate, confused, and it can put us into a crisis to hear somebody in such a crisis. So, confused, disoriented callers can sometimes be sensitive to other people. So it's not uncommon for a disturbed caller to unearth some of our own hidden agendas and insecurities. So it's really important that if you start having strong reactions, either positive or negative, to callers, that you should alert the hotline worker that's processing and doing feedback with coworkers and get some supervision. We're all human, so we're all going to have our own feelings about what people are saying to us on the phone. Avoid placating. So placating and sympathizing do little to bolster the caller's confidence and to help move them towards actions. So we really want to respond empathetically, but we don't want to be sympathetic. We want to really help make sure they can focus on maybe how they've coped with similar difficulties in their life before. Really help them look for strategies that they've already employed before. And then again, assessing safety or assessing lethality. Many clients who call crisis lines have active suicidal or homicidal ideas. So the thing that's really important to remember is that with all suicidal callers, they're trying to put distance between their thoughts and their actions that might result from those suicidal thoughts, those lethal thoughts. So as much as they say they have these intentions of lethality, they are still in enough control of themselves to attempt to place a buffer, which is the telephone worker, between their thinking and their acting. So that's really good. It's really important not to give out personal information to clients on a crisis line. Rookies on the crisis line can be very taken with the stories that they hear, and they feel very gratified by the strokes that the callers can give them. I've never had anyone so nice help me before, so they can fall for the idea that they're the only ones that would be able to help somebody. It's really important that you stay anonymous, and it works both ways. There are some serious ethical problems that can arise if that anonymity is breached. So crisis line workers need to make sure that they don't give out personal information. Same is true as a social worker. The last few slides were all about problem callers. I'm going to let you read through that in the chapter. It'll tell you all the different types. So how do we handle kind of difficult problem callers, people who are taking up our time inappropriately? We want to pose open-ended questions. You want to use them to diffuse any problems generated by frustrated callers. We want to set time limits. When it is apparent that there's an attempt to refocus the problem to the caller are futile, then it's time limited. So if they don't want to talk about themselves and how to really make a plan to move forward, you really just have to set a time limit for them. Terminate abuse. When a caller's behavior escalates to what the worker perceives as abusive, then the call should be terminated in a clear and firm manner. Switch workers, particularly with sexually explicit callers. Switching the call to another worker, preferably a male, takes the stimulus thrill out of the situation and makes it very difficult for the caller to, keep going in the same direction. Using covert modeling and conditioning. Covert modeling or conditioning has been used to extinguish repeated calls, particularly by the sexually explicit client. In covert modeling, the client is asked to use mental imagery to picture either reinforcing or extinguishing a particular behavior. You can read more about that on page 133. And formulate administrative rules. This is to extinguish abusive behavior by limiting the number and the duration of calls from any single caller, limiting the topics that will be discussed, requiring that only specific workers versed in handling abusive callers take such calls, use speakerphones for on-the-spot consultation, require the caller to establish a face-to-face relationship with an outside worker, and then allow communication between the therapist and the crisis line staff, and allow the staff to prohibit calls for a day, a week, or more if physical threats are made. So clearly everybody spends a lot of their life online these days. So the internet's growing role in crisis intervention. It's grown. There's some ethical concerns and limited training that's kind of gone on with some professionals, and there's just kind of a lack of understanding sort of the ethics and values around social work. So it's a lot of people who maybe aren't licensed. There might not be insurance. Confidentiality would be a major thing to be concerned about on the internet. A lot of people that, I don't know, they don't understand kind of the professional things that need to take place in a counseling relationship. So taking it online can sometimes just take down the standards of the profession. Many consumers are willing and eager to use technology-based forms of therapy. It seems easier to people, and it's, again, something that is more commonly accepted because people like to talk to people online. There's a whole discussion in your book on 138 through 140, and you can read kind of some of the ethical issues.